Brian Shaffer entered a crowded bar in Columbus, Ohio on a Friday night back in 2006. Security cameras recorded him going inside, they recorded people coming and going from the premises, but Brian was never seen leaving the building. No footage shows him exit, no witnesses recall seeing him walk out, and despite extensive searches, Brian Shaffer was never ever found. It's midnight somewhere, and tonight I have a story for you. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old. He was a medical student at Ohio State University, preparing to begin his final year. Friends described him as outgoing, social, and also very dependable. Brian had recently endured a very difficult period in his life. Only months earlier, his mother had passed away from a long-suffered illness. Now, despite that loss, those close to him said Brian was moving forward. He was focused on school, he was close with his father, and he was very much looking ahead. Nothing about Brian's life suggested that he was preparing to disappear. Now, on the evening of March 31st, 2006, Brian went out with his friends to celebrate the start of spring break. They arrived at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, which is a popular bar located near the campus. The bar was very busy, music was nice and loud, and the students filled the entire space. Brian was seen talking, laughing, moving easily through the crowd. Nothing about his behaviour appeared to be very unusual. At one point, Brian even became separated from his friends inside of the bar. Now, for this type of scenario, that wasn't uncommon in a crowded place like the Ugly Tuna. But sadly, that would be the last confirmed moment that anybody saw Brian again. Now, the Ugly Tuna Saloon was locked on the second floor of a building. To reach it, patrons had to enter through a single set of doors at street level and then walk upstairs, and security cameras covered that entrance. The cameras clearly recorded Brian entering the building earlier that night. They also recorded dozens of people that were leaving. Friends, strangers, groups, individuals, but Brian never appears on that footage ever again. No camera shows him exiting the building, and no alternate exit was ever confirmed to have been used. Now, Brian's friends, they expected him to rejoin them, but when he didn't, they just assumed that he'd gone home. Hours passed, then the next day, when Brian didn't answer his phone or show up as expected, concern began to grow. Attempts to contact him failed. Brian never checked his voicemail, he never accessed his bank accounts, and he never made contact with anybody ever again. Now, police were notified and an investigation began. The building was searched, including construction areas, storage spaces, and nearby rooms. Surrounding businesses were checked, nearby streets and alleys were examined. Search teams looked for any sign or any sort of clue that Brian had left the area, but absolutely nothing turned up and absolutely nothing was found. No personal belongings, no clothing, and no indication of any sort of struggle. There was simply no trace of Brian after that night. So, Brian disappeared from a crowded bar on a busy street in a building with security cameras. There was no confirmed sighting of him leaving, no evidence that he ever met with anybody afterward, and no indication that he planned to vanish. For someone to disappear under those circumstances without leaving behind a single piece of evidence raised questions that have never ever been settled. Now, as time went on, as per most cases, with no evidence to produce any sorts of leads or to give any sort of clear direction to go on, the case eventually grew colder. Private investigators became involved and tips were followed and then dismissed. Occasional sightings were reported in other cities, but none were confirmed. Brian's family desperately continued searching, but despite years of effort, no trace of Brian ever emerged. No remains were ever found, none of Brian's belongings were ever found, and very sadly for Brian's friends and family, no answers ever arrived. So, unfortunately, Brian Shaffer didn't disappear in isolation, he vanished in the middle of a crowd, surrounded by people, noise, and cameras, and a place where someone should have seen something. But after that moment inside the bar, there's nothing, just silence and a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Brian Shaffer, to this date, has never ever been found. Now, if you like dark stories told at midnight, make sure that you're subscribed, and I'd love to hear your comments down below on what you think might have happened to Brian. And until then, I'll see you at midnight.